The cold metal restraints around Captain Daniel Cross's wrists bit into his skin as two massive Zitherian guards dragged him through the grand halls of the alien palace. His boots scraped against the polished floor, leaving scuff marks behind. A small act of defiance. His head throbbed from the earlier battle, but his mind remained sharp, eyes scanning everything. He was not afraid. The throne room was vast, built from dark stone, with towering pillars reaching towards a ceiling high enough to disappear into shadows. Alien banners hung from the walls, and the air smelled of something unfamiliar, a mix of burning incense and metal. At the center, upon an elevated throne, she sat, Queen Virelia of the Zitherian Empire. She was tall, regal, and commanding, her violet skin glowing faintly under the dim lights. A crown of black crystal rested upon her head, and her piercing silver eyes locked onto him. Unlike the guards, her expression was not filled with hatred or cruelty. It was something else, curiosity. Cross was shoved onto his knees before her. He refused to lower his head, keeping his sharp gaze fixed on hers. His body was battered, his squad was missing, but his will remained unshaken. Virelia leaned forward slightly, resting her elbow on the armrest of her throne. "Human, why are you looking at me with anger?" she asked, her voice smooth but commanding. Cross clenched his jaw. His muscles tensed against his restraints. He wanted to spit out his rage, to demand answers, but he knew showing too much emotion would give her the satisfaction of knowing she had control. Instead, he kept his voice steady. "Because you butchered my people," he said, his tone cold and sharp. The room fell silent. Even the guards shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke to the queen like that. But instead of reacting with fury, she laughed. A soft, almost amused chuckle. "Butchered," she repeated, tilting her head. "Your fleet attacked our patrol first. Your kind called us invaders for simply defending what is ours." Cross's fists clenched, the restraints cutting into his skin. "Your empire expands by conquering and enslaving others. That's not defense. That's war." Virelia sighed, as if disappointed rather than angry. "You see only what you wish to see, human. Your species is young, reckless. You think yourselves superior, yet you stumble into conflicts you cannot win." She stood from her throne and descended the steps, stopping just before him. She was taller than he expected, nearly 7 feet in height. Cross refused to be intimidated. He stared up at her with the same burning intensity. "You underestimate humans," he said, his voice like steel. Virelia studied him for a long moment. "Perhaps," she admitted. "But tell me, Captain Cross, why do you fight with such passion? What makes humans so stubborn?" Cross took a slow breath. He didn't want to give her anything, but something inside him demanded she understand. "Because we don't bow to tyrants. We don't fight for glory or expansion. We fight for our people, our homes, our freedom. That's something you'll never understand." For the first time, Virelia's expression shifted. There was a flicker of something behind her silver eyes, something unreadable. Then she smirked. "Perhaps I wish to understand," she said, stepping back. She turned to her guards. "Take him to the war chambers. I want to speak with him further." Cross expected them to drag him away to a prison cell, but instead, the guards lifted him to his feet and escorted him deeper into the palace. His anger still burned, but now, curiosity mixed with it. What was this queen planning? Whatever it was, he would be ready. Captain Daniel Cross walked in silence, his hand still bound as the Zitherian guards escorted him through the dimly lit corridors of the palace. The stone walls were covered in alien symbols, some glowing faintly with energy. The air was cool, filled with an unsettling quiet. His mind was sharp despite the pain from the battle. He had expected to be thrown into a dark prison cell, left to rot like many prisoners of war. But instead, the alien queen had ordered him to be taken to the war chambers. What did she want? The doors ahead slid open with a hiss. Inside, the war chambers were massive, with a giant holographic display at the center, showing various planets and battle formations. Several Zitherian commanders stood around it, their armor gleaming under the pale light. At the far end of the room, Queen Varelia stood with her back to him, studying the battlefield projections. Her tall, regal figure remained still as the guards pushed him forward. "You may leave," she commanded. The guards hesitated for a moment but obeyed, exiting and sealing the doors behind them. Now, it was just the Queen and the human. Cross remained standing, his gaze locked onto her. Even without weapons, without freedom, he refused to show weakness. Varelia turned to face him, her silver eyes sharp with curiosity. "You do not fear me," she observed. Cross let out a short breath. "Fear? No," he said firmly. "But I do hate what you stand for." The Queen raised an eyebrow. "You assume much, Captain Cross. You see me as a monster, yet you know nothing about me." Cross narrowed his eyes. "I know enough. You command a fleet that destroys everything in its path. Your empire takes what it wants, leaving nothing but ashes behind. And now you've captured my people, using them as bargaining chips." Varelia sighed, stepping closer. "And if our roles were reversed?" she asked. "If it were your people with the power, would they be any different?" Cross stiffened, his jaw tightening. "Humans fight for survival, not conquest. We fight because we have no choice." The Queen studied him in silence for a moment. Then, to his surprise, she unfastened the restraints around his wrists. The metal cuffs clattered to the floor. Cross rolled his shoulders, rubbing his wrists where the metal had cut into his skin. He was free, at least for now. But he was no fool. He was still deep within enemy territory, unarmed, and surrounded by soldiers. Varelia stepped back, gesturing toward the holographic battlefield. "I have seen countless species break under the weight of war," she said. "But humans, you are different. You are stubborn, unpredictable. You refuse to submit, even in defeat." Cross crossed his arms. "And that surprises you." "It intrigues me," she corrected. "Which is why I am giving you an opportunity." Cross frowned. "What kind of opportunity?" She turned back to the battle map. "Your fleet is scattered. Your people are prisoners. You have no reinforcements coming. You are on the losing side of this war, Captain Cross." His hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. The Queen glanced at him. "However, I do not wish to waste a mind like yours. Your understanding of strategy, your ability to fight against impossible odds. These are rare qualities. I could use someone like you." Cross laughed bitterly. "You expect me to betray my own people?" Varelia shook her head. "No, I expect you to prove yourself." A large door on the side of the chamber suddenly slid open, revealing a training arena beyond it. The walls were reinforced with metal plating, and at the center stood a massive Zitherian warrior, towering over even the Queen. His muscles were thick with layered armor, and his claws flexed as he eyed Cross like prey. "You will face my champion," Varelia announced. "If you survive, I will consider releasing your people. If you fall, well, you will have proven that humans are not as strong as they claim." Cross stared at the hulking alien warrior. The Zitherian was at least twice his size, built like a walking tank. "So that's it?" he asked, rolling his shoulders. "You want me to fight to entertain you?" Varelia smirked. "No, Captain. I want to see if you are truly worthy of standing against me." Cross exhaled slowly. He was exhausted. His body ached from the previous battle. And he had no weapons. But deep inside, a fire still burned. He met the Queen's silver gaze. "Fine," he said. "But don't blame me if your champion doesn't walk away from this." Varelia's smirk widened slightly. "Then let's begin." As the doors to the arena sealed behind him, Cross took a deep breath. His heart pounded, but not from fear. He had fought impossible odds before, and he was ready to do it again. The doors of the arena slammed shut behind Captain Daniel Cross, sealing him inside with the massive Zitherian warrior. The air was thick with tension, the scent of metal and energy weapons filling his lungs. The crowd of alien officers and guards gathered around the upper levels, eager to see how long the human would last. Some were smirking, others whispering among themselves. None of them believed he could win. Queen Virelia sat above, her silver eyes sharp and focused. She leaned forward slightly, interested in what was about to happen. At the center of the arena stood the champion, a towering Zetherian warrior named Carax, his body covered in thick armor-like skin. His four muscular arms flexed, claws twitching in anticipation. The Zetherians were already a physically superior race, but this one was a monster, and Cross had no weapons. Carax grinned, his deep voice rumbling. "You should have begged for your life, human." Cross rolled his shoulders, cracking his neck, "and missed the chance to embarrass you in front of your queen." "Not a chance." The Zetherians laughed, a tiny human mocking their greatest warrior. It was absurd. The signal to begin flashed across the arena walls. Carax charged forward, the ground shaking beneath his massive frame. Cross dodged, barely avoiding a strike that could have shattered his ribs. He moved fast, using his smaller size to slip past the Zetherian's reach. The crowd roared, expecting Carax to grab him within seconds. But Cross wasn't just any soldier. He was trained, experienced, and most importantly, he was human. Carax swung a massive arm, and Cross ducked, rolling to the side. He kicked off the wall, using the momentum to drive his elbow into the alien's side. It was like hitting a steel wall. Carax barely flinched, but his eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected the human to move so quickly. Cross kept moving, refusing to let Carax land a solid hit. He used speed, instincts, and strategy. Things brute strength alone couldn't match. But time was against him. One mistake, and this fight would be over. Above the arena, Queen Virelia watched closely, her fingers resting against her lips in thought. She had expected a quick battle, a demonstration of why humans could never stand against the Zetherians. But Cross was proving her wrong. The way he moved, the way he analyzed the fight in real time, adapting to Carax's attacks, it was remarkable. This was not blind rage or desperate survival. This was strategy. For the first time in a long while, she felt genuine curiosity. Back in the arena, Carax was growing frustrated. He had never struggled this much against an unarmed opponent before. He roared and lunged again. This time, Cross made his move. As Carax's massive fist came down, Cross twisted to the side, catching the alien's wrist and using his own momentum against him. With a quick pivot, Cross drove his knee into the side of the Zetherian's leg, right where the joint was weakest. Carax stumbled. The crowd gasped. Cross didn't stop. He struck again, this time aiming for the exposed section under Carax's ribs. A precise blow, a weak spot. The alien staggered backward, growling in pain. For the first time, the Zetherian champion looked uncertain. Cross smirked. "Looks like you're not as tough as you thought." The crowd fell silent. Queen Virelia stood slowly from her throne. She had seen enough. "The fight ends. Stop." Her voice echoed through the arena. Carax froze, panting heavily. His pride burned, but he did not disobey. Cross stood tall, sweat dripping down his face, but his spirit unshaken. Virelia descended the steps toward the arena floor. The guards immediately stepped aside. She walked up to Cross, studying him closely. There was no fear in his eyes, no desperation, only defiance. "You fight like a warrior, not a soldier," she said, tilting her head slightly. "You see weakness and strike with precision." Cross breathed heavily, but remained silent. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. "I could use someone like you." The crowd murmured in shock. A human, working for the queen. Impossible. Cross frowned. "Use me." Virelia crossed her arms. "You won this fight. You prove that humans are more than I expected. Her eyes gleamed with something dangerous. Join me. Become my strategist, my warrior. Stand beside me, and your people will be spared. The offer hung in the air like a blade. Cross's jaw tightened. And if I refuse? Virelia's smile faded slightly. Then your people remain my prisoners. You, however, will be honored as a warrior. He understood the meaning behind her words. Refusing meant death. The crowd waited in silence, watching the human, waiting to see his choice. Cross exhaled, his mind racing. He had no reason to trust her, but he also had no choice but to play the game. Finally, he met her gaze and smirked. Well, Queen Virelia, looks like you just got yourself a problem. Her silver eyes narrowed slightly, but instead of anger, there was something else. Amusement. The game had begun. The air inside the royal war chambers was thick with silence. Captain Daniel Cross stood tall, his body aching from the recent fight, but his mind sharp as ever. The Zitherian guards lined the walls, their expressions unreadable. Queen Virelia sat on her high throne, watching him with those silver eyes that seemed to pierce into his soul. She had given him an offer. Serve her, and his people would be spared. Cross clenched his fists. He didn't trust her, but he had no choice but to play along for now. Very well, human. Virelia finally spoke, her voice smooth but filled with power. Since you wish to be a problem, let us see how much trouble you can truly cause. She gestured toward a massive holographic display at the center of the chamber. A map of the battlefield appeared, showing human and Zitherian fleets locked in a dangerous conflict across the galaxy. This is your war, Captain Cross, she said, standing from her throne and walking toward him. Tell me, if you were in my position, how would you end it? Cross narrowed his eyes. Was this another test? A trick to see if he would betray his people? He exhaled slowly. If I were you, I'd negotiate peace, he said, his voice calm but firm. Your empire is stretching itself too thin. The longer you fight, the weaker your forces become. You may win battles, but you're losing the war. Some of the Zitherian commanders growled in disapproval, their pride wounded by his words. Virelia, however, only smirked. Interesting, she said, tilting her head. But you assume we are willing to settle. We do not surrender, Captain. We conquer. Cross crossed his arms. And where has that gotten you? More enemies, more rebellions, and now, a human who just took down your champion. The room fell silent. Virelia's smirk faded, but instead of anger, there was something else in her expression. Curiosity, respect, amusement. You speak boldly, she said. Most beings in your position would be begging for mercy. Cross let out a small chuckle. I guess humans aren't like most beings. The Queen studied him for a moment before turning to one of her officers. Release the human prisoners, she commanded. Cross's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected her to do that so soon. But my queen, one of the commanders protested. She raised a hand, silencing him. Do as I say, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Cross nodded slowly. You're playing a dangerous game, Queen. Virelia's eyes gleamed. As are you, Captain. The escape plan. Later that night, Cross was escorted to his quarters. Not a prison cell, but an actual room. It was small but comfortable, with a view of the stars outside the palace. He sat on the bed, his mind racing. His people were being released, but that didn't mean they were safe yet. He needed a plan, a way to get himself off this planet too. A soft chime sounded at the door. Cross tensed. Come in. The door slid open, and to his surprise, it was Virelia herself. She stepped inside, her movements graceful, her silver eyes focused on him. She wasn't wearing her royal battle armor anymore, just a simple dark cloak, making her look less like a queen and more like a person. You're full of surprises, human, she said, standing near the window. Tell me, Did you expect me to release your people? Cross leaned back against the wall. No, I expected you to use them as leverage. She smirked. And yet, I let them go. Why? She turned to face him. Because you intrigue me, Captain Cross. You are not like the other warriors we have faced. You fight with your mind as much as your body. You do not simply follow orders, you question them. Cross sighed. Is that a compliment? Perhaps, she said. Then, after a moment, she added, I did not lie when I said I could use someone like you. Cross studied her carefully. And if I say no? She tilted her head slightly. Then you will leave when the next transport arrives, and we will continue this war as enemies. Cross clenched his jaw. She was giving him a choice, but was it really a choice at all? You don't strike me as someone who lets valuable things go so easily, he said. Varelia's smirk returned. You are correct. A dangerous silence settled between them. Then she stepped closer. But perhaps there is another way. Something neither of us expected. Cross frowned. And what's that? She studied him for a long moment, then said, an alliance. A temporary one. Not as a ruler and a soldier, but as two warriors who wish to survive what's coming next. Cross narrowed his eyes. And what exactly is coming next? Varelia's expression turned serious. Something far worse than this war, Captain. Something that threatens both our species. Cross's heart pounded. He had thought she was just another conqueror, another ruler hungry for power. But now there was something else in her eyes. Fear. Tell me everything, he said. The Queen nodded. And for the first time, they spoke not as enemies, but as allies. The moonlight filtered through the thick windows of the palace, casting long shadows across Captain Daniel Cross's room. The stars outside were bright, a reminder of the vastness of the galaxy, and the countless challenges he had yet to face. Cross stood near the window, staring out at the distant horizon. His mind raced. Queen Varelia had given him an offer to join her as an ally, not as a servant, but as a strategist and a warrior. She had released his people, a move that seemed both generous and dangerous. He couldn't tell if it was a sign of true respect, or she was using him for something else. Still, he had no other option. His people were free for now, and he needed to keep them that way. The quiet hum of the palace filled the room, but Cross couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. He turned, his hand instinctively moving to where his weapon would have been. But then he remembered. It was gone. Come in, he called, his voice calm. The door slid open, and there she stood, Varelia, her tall frame silhouetted against the dim lights of the hallway. She entered without hesitation, closing the door behind her. You look deep in thought, Captain, she said, her voice smooth but laced with curiosity. Cross met her gaze. I'm always thinking. It's part of the job. She walked toward him, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for something hidden. And what is it you're thinking about now? He took a breath. You. I'm still trying to figure out why you'd release my people. That's not something a conqueror does. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was more thoughtful, almost sincere. I don't see myself as a conqueror. At least not in the way you think. I simply do what is necessary to ensure the survival of my people. Cross raised an eyebrow. By conquering everyone else. By ensuring my people's strength. Sometimes survival requires sacrifices. She turned away, walking to the holographic display at the center of the room, where maps and data filled the air. You said you would negotiate peace if you were in my position. Cross followed her, his eyes never leaving her. I still believe that's the only way out of this. Both our species are at the brink of something catastrophic. Varelia's expression shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing, but she didn't look at him. You are correct. There is something far worse coming, something we must prepare for. Cross stepped closer, his voice low. What are we facing then? Her voice was grave as she turned toward him. "There are other powers in this galaxy, forces more powerful than any of us can imagine. The Zitherian Empire may be strong, but there are beasts that even we cannot defeat. They have been watching us, and now they are ready to strike." Cross's heart skipped a beat. He had heard of alien races in the far reaches of space, creatures that could lay waste to entire civilizations. But he had never imagined they could be real, much less a threat to both humans and Cytherians. "Are they already here?" he asked, his voice thick with tension. Varelia nodded. "Yes, and they have already begun their attacks. We have only weeks, maybe days, before they come for us." Cross clenched his fists. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. He had been caught up in a war with the Cytherians, but now the stakes had just been raised. His people were at risk, not just from the Cytherians, but from something much darker. Varelia's eyes softened for the first time. "I never intended for you to be part of this, Captain, but I cannot face this alone. I need someone like you, someone who thinks outside of the box." Cross took a deep breath, processing her words. "What do you need me to do?" She stepped closer to him, her voice low and urgent. "I need you to help me unite our forces, the Zitherians and the humans. Together, we can stand against this threat, but only if we work together." Cross stared at her. He had never considered working alongside the Zitherian Empire, especially not after everything that had happened. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about survival. "I don't trust you," he said, his voice cold. "But I'll work with you, for now, because I want my people to survive." Varelia's expression remained serious. "That's all I'm asking for, Captain." She paused. "It's time to stop fighting each other and start fighting the real enemy." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the decision hung in the air between them, like an invisible force. Cross's mind raced. He knew this could be a trap, a way for Varelia to gain the upper hand. But he also knew that the real enemy was out there, and if they didn't unite, both of their species would fall. He took a step forward, meeting her gaze with a firm resolve. "All right," he said. "We fight together." Varelia nodded slowly, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "Good. Together, we might just have a chance." The Zitherian palace hummed quietly around Captain Daniel Cross as he sat in a secluded meeting room with Queen Varelia. The holographic display between them flickered with images of Zitherian forces and human resistance units scattered across the galaxy. It was a war council of sorts, but the mood was unlike any Cross had ever experienced. For once, he wasn't an enemy in the room. He wasn't an intruder or a prisoner. He was an ally, though it felt strange to admit. Even now, after everything, he could still see the distant suspicion in Varelia's eyes, as if she wasn't entirely sure whether this alliance was the right choice. But she had brought him here, given him a seat at the table. Cross leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the battle plans. "Your fleet's in trouble," he said. "You've spread yourselves too thin, fighting on multiple fronts. You need reinforcements, and you need them now." Varelia stood by the window, her back to him, her voice carrying a touch of sadness that he hadn't expected. "I know, but reinforcements aren't coming. The other Zitherian fleets are already engaged in their own battles. We're fighting alone now." "Then why fight?" Cross asked. "Why not surrender to the enemy and save your people the loss?" Varelia's voice turned sharp as she turned to face him. "Surrender?" She laughed bitterly. "Do you think my people would ever accept surrender? We are not cowards. We conquer. That's what the Zitherian Empire does." Cross was quiet for a moment, trying to piece together the mindset of a queen who had been raised in a culture of dominance and survival. She was proud, fierce, and determined. But even she knew the stakes had changed. This wasn't just about winning wars anymore. This was about keeping the Zitherian race alive. "So, what's your plan?" Cross asked, meeting her gaze. Varelia took a deep breath, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I'll do whatever it takes to ensure the survival of my people, even if it means sacrificing everything. Cross was about to respond, but before he could, the door to the room slid open. One of the Zitherian officers stepped inside, his face tight with urgency. "My queen, we have incoming. The enemy is closing in faster than expected." Virelia's expression shifted in an instant from resolve to something else. Fear. But she didn't show it, not to her soldiers, not to Cross. She nodded curtly. "Send the fleet to battle stations. We'll make our stand here." The officer hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how the human would react. But Virelia waved him off. "I trust Captain Cross will assist us in planning our defense." Cross raised an eyebrow. "So you do trust me?" Virelia's lips twitched slightly, but there was no amusement in her expression. "You're the only one with any experience fighting in these kinds of conditions. You and your people may have been fighting wars for centuries, but the Zitherians, we've never had an enemy like this." Cross nodded, taking his place at the table where the maps of the galaxy flickered in front of them. The enemy wasn't a simple alien force. They were something different. Advanced. Ruthless. He could see it in the data. "We can't just send your fleet head-on into this," Cross said. "You'll get torn apart before you even make contact. We need to outthink them, not just outfight them." Virelia's eyes narrowed. "What do you suggest?" Cross studied the battle projections. He didn't know much about Cytherian tactics, but he knew enough about human adaptability to come up with a plan. "We need to create a diversion, something that will confuse them long enough for your fleet to get into position. I'll take a small group and lure them in. We'll use their overconfidence against them." Virelia looked at him for a long moment, clearly weighing the risk. "You're suggesting we send you into the heart of the enemy fleet?" "Yes," Cross said simply. "But we need to be prepared to move quickly. Once we've drawn them in, we'll need to strike before they can regroup. It's a high-risk operation, but it's the only chance you've got." Virelia turned back to the holographic map, her fingers tracing the enemy positions. "And how do you plan on surviving this?" Cross smirked, the old soldier's confidence slipping into his voice. "Humans have a way of surviving the impossible." Outside the palace walls. As the war council ended, Cross walked through the hallways of the palace, his mind still processing the plan. The feeling of uncertainty hung over him, but it wasn't just the battle they had to face. It was something deeper. The Zitherians were not built for alliances, and neither were humans. They were enemies, yet here he was, making plans alongside the very queen who had once been his enemy. The lines between them were blurring. He didn't know if he could trust her or not, but the enemy was coming, and they had to be ready. Cross stopped at a balcony that overlooked the sprawling city below. The lights of the Zitherian capital blinked like stars in the night. He was no longer just fighting for his people. He was fighting for the survival of two species who, against all odds, might just have a chance together. The night before the battle, the air in the Zitherian palace felt thick with tension. Captain Daniel Cross sat alone in his quarters, staring at the map of the enemy's forces, now displayed on a holographic screen in front of him. The plan was set, and tomorrow would be the day everything would change. But despite the certainty of his actions, there was something gnawing at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. The Zitherians had been his enemy since the moment he'd stepped foot on their planet. His loyalty had always been with his people, and yet here he was, working side by side with the very queen who had once ordered his capture. He stood, his mind racing. How could he trust Virelia, the queen who had killed and conquered without a second thought, now asking for his help in saving her empire? Could he really work alongside someone like that? The door slid open with a soft hiss, breaking his thoughts. He turned quickly to see Virelia standing in the doorway. "You're awake," she said softly, stepping inside. Cross nodded, his gaze still fixed on the map. "I'm trying to find a way to survive this," he replied, his voice flat. Virelia closed the door behind her and approached the table, looking at the display with him. "I know you're not fully convinced," she said, her tone surprisingly gentle. "But we both know what's coming. We can't afford to be divided any longer." Cross didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath and finally spoke, his voice steady. "I didn't sign up for this. I never planned on working together with you. You're the one who invaded my planet, who took my people as prisoners." Virelia's eyes flashed with a flicker of emotion, but she kept her composure. "I have no excuses, Captain. But the war we're fighting now, it's bigger than all of us." She paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. "If we don't stop the enemy, there will be nothing left. No more Zetherians, no more humans, just destruction." Cross could feel the weight of her words. He knew the enemy was relentless, merciless, and they would stop at nothing to tear both of their species apart. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a battle between the Zetherians and humans anymore. It was a battle for survival. "You're asking me to trust you," he said quietly, his voice low. "But how do I know you won't turn on us once the enemy is gone?" Virelia's expression softened, and for the first time, she seemed less like a queen and more like a person. "I can't promise you that. All I can do is fight for my people, just like you're fighting for yours." Cross met her gaze, searching for any sign of dishonesty. But all he found was resolve. "You've already given me your word," she continued, her voice firm. "And for now, that has to be enough. If we survive this, we can figure out what happens next. But we need to win first." Cross didn't respond immediately. He glanced at the map, his mind working through the plan once again. There was no turning back now. The enemy was closing in, and they had only one chance to make it work. Finally, he looked back at Virelia, a hint of respect in his eyes. "All right, let's do this." She nodded, a slight smile crossing her face. "Good. Tomorrow, we fight together. The battle begins." The next morning, the palace was alive with energy as the Zetherian fleet prepared for battle. Cross had joined the Zetherian commanders, now acting as a strategist alongside them, directing their ships and forces to better positions. The alliance was still fragile, but it was their only option if they wanted to survive. Cross stood on the bridge of a Zetherian warship, overlooking the vast expanse of space. His heart pounded in his chest as the enemy fleet came into view. It was bigger than he had imagined, its ships dark and foreboding against the backdrop of stars. They were not just invaders. They were relentless destroyers. Virelia's voice came over the communication system. "We've made our decision, Captain. There's no going back now." "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "Just don't leave me hanging when the time comes." Virelia's voice was calm, but with a sharp edge. "I wouldn't dream of it." The two fleets moved closer. Cross and Virelia had arranged for the Zetherians to strike first, drawing the enemy's attention, while the humans waited in the shadows, ready to flank. It was a risky move, but it was their best shot. Cross stood tall, the reality of the battle weighing heavily on him. He was a soldier, a leader, and he had never felt more like a pawn in someone else's game. But for now, the game was survival, the moment of truth. The battle started with a thunderous roar, ships exchanging fire in the cold vastness of space. Cross could see the Zetherian fleet pulling the enemy in, just as he had planned. The enemy ships fired back, but they were too slow to react to the sudden shift in tactics. Cross's hand tightened on the controls, his eyes scanning the field. "Now, human ships go." The human fleet emerged from their hiding spots, charging in from behind, launching everything they had at the exposed enemy ships. The tide of the battle began to shift, the enemy taken by surprise. But the true test had just begun. The enemy regrouped quickly, retaliating with force. The battle was far from won, and they were far from safe. A turning point. The fight raged on for hours, the sound of blaster fire and explosions filling the silence of space. Cross's fleet moved with precision, his strategies working, but the enemy was relentless. Ships on both sides were destroyed, and lives were lost. Finally, Cross saw the Cytherian flagship emerge, Varelia's ship at the forefront, taking on the enemy's strongest unit. It was the final push. He took a deep breath. The choice was made. Victory was within reach.